The God-Intoxicated Man, Understanding Spinoza and the Philosophy of Substance. In this video, we'll break down one of the greatest philosophers of the modern era. From his radical identification of God with nature, through his belief that everything is part of a single infinite substance, to believing that freedom comes from understanding necessity. This is Baruch Spinoza, born in 1632 into the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. He would become known as the God-Intoxicated Man. But beneath this poetic title lies one of the most rigorous and revolutionary thinkers in human history. A man who saw what others missed, who understood that the universe operates according to rational necessity if only we have the courage to accept it. Spinoza was born into relative prosperity and comfort. His family were successful merchants who had fled the Inquisition in Portugal to find refuge in the religiously tolerant Dutch Republic. He received a traditional Jewish education, studying Hebrew, the Torah, the Talmud, and medieval Jewish philosophy. He could have lived a comfortable life as a respected member of the Jewish community, perhaps taking over the family merchant business. But something in his nature rejected this conventional path. According to historical records, he began questioning traditional religious doctrines in his early 20s, engaging in philosophical discussions that alarmed the rabbis of Amsterdam. His heterodox views became so troubling that in 1656, at the age of 23, he was issued one of the harshest writs of excommunication ever pronounced by the Amsterdam Jewish community. The cherem declared him cursed by day and cursed by night, banned from all contact with Jews, his name to be blotted out from memory. Why did Spinoza develop ideas so dangerous that his own community expelled him? Some have suggested it was mere youthful rebellion or pride. But this misunderstands his entire project. Spinoza believed that truth must be pursued wherever it leads, regardless of social consequences or traditional authority. He could not accept religious doctrines that contradicted reason simply because they were supported by scripture or tradition. His excommunication was not the result of deliberate provocation, but the inevitable consequence of honest philosophical inquiry. The world into which Spinoza was born was one of tremendous intellectual and political upheaval. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the unity of Western Christianity. The scientific revolution was transforming understanding of the natural world through the work of Galileo, Descartes, and others. The Dutch Republic had recently won independence from Spain and was experiencing a golden age of commercial prosperity, artistic achievement, and relative intellectual freedom. Thinkers throughout Europe were questioning traditional authorities and seeking new foundations for knowledge. But Spinoza saw something these earlier thinkers had missed. They were trying to reconcile the new science with traditional religion to make room for both mechanical necessity and divine providence, both natural law and supernatural intervention. He realized that this reconciliation was impossible, and that genuine understanding required abandoning the traditional conception of God entirely. What makes Spinoza unique among early modern philosophers is his willingness to follow reason to its conclusions without compromise or evasion. Where Descartes separated mind and matter to preserve space for the soul and free will, Spinoza insisted on their ultimate unity. Where Leibniz multiplied substances to reconcile science and religion, Spinoza reduced everything to a single substance. Where most thinkers tried to preserve conventional morality and religious doctrine, Spinoza reconstructed ethics from the ground up based on rational principles. This was not atheistic materialism, but something more subtle, a radical reconception of divinity itself. His philosophy speaks to us across 4 centuries, because he addressed questions that remain urgently relevant. How do we reconcile scientific determinism with human freedom? How do we find meaning in a universe governed by impersonal laws? How do we ground ethics without appeal to divine commands or supernatural rewards and punishments? How do We achieve happiness in a world that seems indifferent to our desires. These are not abstract academic questions, but practical challenges that every thoughtful person faces. Through his major work, The Ethics, written in the geometric style with definitions, axioms, and proofs, Spinoza created a philosophy that remains as challenging and illuminating today as it was in the 17th century. He saw the universe as a single, infinite substance that is simultaneously God and nature. He understood human beings as finite modes of this infinite substance, determined by the same laws that govern all nature. He recognized that freedom comes not from escaping necessity, but from understanding it. His ideas remain as relevant today as they were 350 years ago, perhaps even more so in our age of scientific materialism, environmental crisis, and the decline of traditional religious authority. Chiat, Part 1. God or Nature. The most famous and controversial phrase in Spinoza's philosophy is one that appears throughout his work and that captures the essence of his revolutionary metaphysics. Deus sive natura, God or nature. These three Latin words contain within them an entire worldview, a complete transformation of how we understand both divinity and the natural world. To grasp what Spinoza meant requires us to abandon everything we usually assume about God and nature and how they relate to each other. Traditional theology, whether Jewish, Christian, or Islamic, conceives of God as a being separate from the world he created. God existed before the world and chose to create it. He could have created a different world or no world at all. He transcends the natural order and can intervene in it through miracles. He has purposes and intentions. He judges human actions and responds to prayers. He is personal, conscious, and acts from will rather than necessity. Nature, in this traditional view, is God's creation, a realm of finite, changing, dependent things that exist only because God chose to make them exist. But Spinoza systematically dismantled every aspect of this traditional conception. He argued that there cannot be two substances, one infinite and one finite, one necessary and one contingent, one divine and one natural. There can be only one substance, and that substance must be absolutely infinite, existing necessarily, and containing within itself everything that exists or can exist. This one substance is what we call God, but it is also what we call nature. Not nature as a collection of finite things, but nature as the infinite totality, the complete system of existence itself. When Spinoza says God or nature, the or is crucial. He is not saying there is a God, and separately there is nature. He is saying that God and nature are two names for the same reality viewed from different perspectives. When we think of this infinite substance in terms of its absolute existence, its necessity, its infinity, we call it God. When we think of it in terms of its concrete determinations, its endless variety of finite things and processes, we call it nature. But we are referring to the same reality. This identification was deeply shocking to Spinoza's contemporaries and remains counterintuitive even today. If God is identical with nature, then God is not a person who thinks, chooses, and acts. God has no will, no purposes, no preferences. God does not create the world by choice, but produces it by necessity, the way a triangle's angles necessarily equal 180 degrees. Everything that exists follows from God's nature the way geometric theorems follow from axioms. There is no contingency, no possibility of things being otherwise. Everything that happens must happen exactly as it does. Spinoza illustrated this with rigorous geometric reasoning. A substance is defined as that which exists in itself and is conceived through itself. God is defined as a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each expressing eternal and infinite essence. From these definitions, it follows necessarily that God exists. The ontological argument that had troubled earlier philosophers became for Spinoza a demonstrable theorem. God's essence involves existence. God cannot not exist. But if God exists necessarily, and if God contains all possible attributes, then everything that can exist must exist. There is no distinction between possibility and actuality. Whatever is possible is actual, and whatever is actual is necessary. The universe could not be otherwise than it is. This seems to eliminate divine freedom. If God acts by necessity rather than choice, is God not unfree, constrained by his own nature? Spinoza's answer is radical. God is perfectly free precisely because God acts from the necessity of his own nature alone, not constrained by anything external. True freedom is not the ability to choose between alternatives, but self-determination, acting from one's own nature rather than being compelled by external forces. God is free in the higher sense because nothing outside God exists to constrain him. The identification of God with nature also transforms our understanding of the natural world. Nature is not a collection of finite, changing, dependent things that might not have existed. Nature is the infinite substance itself, existing necessarily, containing within itself infinite attributes and infinite modes. Every finite thing is not a separate substance, but a modification of the one substance, a way that the infinite expresses itself finitely. Consider a wave on the ocean. The wave appears to be a distinct thing, separable from other waves and from the ocean itself. But the wave is not actually separate from the ocean. It is a temporary modification of the ocean, a pattern that arises and dissolves while the ocean remains. The wave is the ocean, but the ocean is not merely the wave. Similarly, every finite thing is God, a mode or modification of the infinite substance. But God is not merely the collection of finite things. God is the infinite totality that expresses itself through these finite modifications. This resolves an ancient theological puzzle. How can an infinite perfect being create a finite, imperfect world without diminishing itself? Spinoza's answer is that God does not create the world as something separate from himself. God expresses himself in infinite ways, and these expressions are what we call the world. Creation is not an act of will, but an eternal process of self-expression. God no more chooses to produce the world than a circle chooses to have its circumference equidistant from its center. It follows from God's nature necessarily and eternally. The God or nature formula also has profound implications for how we should relate to divinity. We cannot worship God as a separate being who might grant our prayers or punish our sins. We cannot fear God's anger or hope for God's mercy. God has no emotions, no preferences, no purposes that might align with or oppose our own. God simply is, existing and acting by the necessity of the divine nature. What then is the appropriate response to God? Spinoza's answer is intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis. We should seek to understand God's nature, to comprehend how everything follows necessarily from the infinite substance. This understanding itself constitutes our highest happiness and our deepest connection to the divine. When we understand necessity, we participate in God's infinite intellect. Our understanding is God's self-understanding occurring through the finite mode that we are. This is not the personal relationship with God promised by traditional religion. It offers no consolation for suffering, no promise of personal immortality, no assurance that the universe cares about human welfare. But it offers something else: the possibility of understanding our place in the infinite totality, of comprehending the necessity that governs all things, of achieving a kind of peace that comes from accepting what cannot be changed. The identification of God with nature is thus both a theological revolution and a liberation. It frees us from fear of divine punishment and false hope for supernatural intervention. It reveals the divinity in nature itself, transforming the world from a temporary creation into an eternal expression of infinite being. It makes the study of nature identical with the knowledge of God. Science becomes a form of worship, and understanding nature becomes the path to salvation. Part 2. Substance, Attributes, and Modes. Spinoza's metaphysical system rests on a careful distinction between three levels of reality: substance, attributes, and modes. Understanding these distinctions is essential to grasping how his philosophy works and what it implies about our place in the universe. These are not arbitrary categories, but follow necessarily from rigorous definition and deduction. The foundation of Spinoza's system is the concept of substance. A substance is that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. This means that a substance does not depend on anything else for its existence or for its being understood. It is self-sufficient, self-explanatory, existing by its own nature rather than being caused by something else. Spinoza argues that there can be only one substance. If there were multiple substances, they would have to differ from each other in some way. But substances can only differ by their attributes, by the essential properties that constitute their nature. If two substances shared all the same attributes, they would be identical, not different. But if they had different attributes, each would be limited, lacking some attributes possessed by the other. A truly infinite substance must possess all possible attributes, must be unlimited in every way. Therefore, there can be only one substance, possessing infinite attributes, each expressing its eternal and infinite essence. This one substance is God or nature, the infinite totality of being. Everything else that exists is not a separate substance, but exists in and is conceived through this one substance. Finite things do not have independent existence, but are determinations or modifications of the infinite substance. They are ways that the infinite substance expresses itself in finite form. Attributes are the fundamental ways that substance expresses its essence. An attribute is what the intellect perceives as constituting the essence of substance. Spinoza holds that substance has infinitely many attributes, but human beings can know only two: thought and extension. Each attribute is infinite in its own kind, expressing the entire nature of substance from a particular perspective. The attribute of extension is what we ordinarily call the physical or material world. Everything that has spatial location, shape, motion, and rest is a mode of the attribute of extension. Bodies, particles, forces, fields, everything studied by physics and the natural sciences falls under this attribute. The attribute of thought is what we ordinarily call the mental or spiritual realm. Ideas, concepts, beliefs, desires, emotions, all mental phenomena are modes of the attribute of thought. Mind, consciousness, understanding, all fall under this attribute. These two attributes do not interact with each other because they are not separate things, but parallel expressions of the same substance. The attribute of extension expresses the infinite substance from the perspective of physical existence. The attribute of thought expresses the same infinite substance from the perspective of mental existence. They are like two descriptions of the same reality in different languages, each complete and self-contained, neither causing or influencing the other. This solves the mind-body problem that plagued Cartesian philosophy. Descartes had claimed that mind and body are distinct substances that somehow interact causally, but he could never explain how this interaction works, how immaterial mind could affect material body or vice versa. Spinoza dissolves the problem by denying that mind and body are distinct substances. They are the same thing, the same mode of the one substance, expressed through different attributes. When you decide to raise your arm and your arm rises, there are not two events, one mental and one physical, with one causing the other. There is one event with two aspects. Considered under the attribute of thought, it is a decision. Considered under the attribute of extension, it is a bodily movement. These are parallel expressions of a single occurrence in substance. The third level of reality consists of modes. A mode is that which is in something else, through which it is also conceived. Modes are determinations or modifications of substance, ways that substance expresses itself finitely. Every particular thing is a mode, every body, every mind, every event, every process. Modes exist in substance and are understood through substance, not independently. Spinoza distinguishes between infinite modes and finite modes. Infinite modes are eternal patterns or laws that follow directly from the nature of substance and its attributes. The laws of physics would be infinite modes of extension. The laws of logic would be infinite modes of thought. These are not contingent regularities but necessary features of how substance expresses itself. Finite modes are particular, temporary determinations of substance. Individual bodies and minds, specific events and processes, are finite modes. They come into existence and pass out of existence. They are caused by other finite modes in infinite causal chains. But ultimately they all express the eternal and infinite substance according to its necessary nature. Every finite mode exists in substance, like waves exist in the ocean. The wave is not separate from the ocean, but is the ocean expressing itself in a particular form. The wave arises from other waves and causes further waves. It has a temporary existence, rising and falling. But it is never actually separate from the ocean. It is the ocean, temporarily configured in this particular way. Similarly, you are not a separate substance existing independently. You are a mode of the infinite substance, a way that God or nature expresses itself finitely. Your body is a finite mode of extension. Your mind is a finite mode of thought. These are not two separate things, but one mode expressed through two attributes. You exist in substance and are comprehensible only through substance. This understanding has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe. We are not strangers in a foreign land, separate souls inhabiting alien matter. We are expressions of the universe itself. Our existence, our consciousness, our thoughts and actions are the universe existing, being conscious, thinking and acting through the particular finite forms we temporarily constitute. We are parts of nature, not apart from nature. The distinction between substance, attributes, and modes also explains how unity and multiplicity coexist. At the level of substance, reality is one, absolutely unified, infinite, and eternal. At the level of attributes, this one reality expresses itself in infinitely many fundamental ways, each infinite in its own kind. At the level of finite modes, these attributes determine themselves in infinitely many particular ways, creating the vast variety and complexity of the natural world. Unity does not exclude multiplicity, but generates it through self-determination. The one substance is not a featureless unity, but infinitely rich, expressing itself in infinite ways through infinite attributes and infinite modes. Everything that exists is substance, but substance is not exhausted by any particular thing or collection of things. It is the infinite whole within which all finite parts exist and through which they are understood. This metaphysical system is not speculation or mysticism, but, Spinoza believed, demonstrable truth, following necessarily from clear definitions and rigorous reasoning. He wrote the Ethics in geometric form, modelled on Euclid's Elements, precisely to show that these conclusions follow necessarily from first principles. Whether he succeeded in this demonstration remains debated, but the system itself, with its vision of reality as a single, infinite substance expressing itself through infinite attributes in infinite modes, provides a comprehensive and coherent framework for understanding everything that exists. Part 3. Determinism and the denial of free will. Few aspects of Spinoza's philosophy are more unsettling to common sense or more radical in their implications than his denial of free will. We ordinarily believe that we make choices, that we could have acted differently than we did, that our decisions are up to us. Spinoza argued that all of this is illusion, that human actions are determined by prior causes just as completely as the motions of planets or the growth of plants. We are not free in the sense we imagine, but we can achieve a different kind of freedom through understanding necessity. Spinoza's determinism follows necessarily from his metaphysics. If everything is a mode of the one substance, if substance acts by the necessity of its nature, then everything that happens must happen exactly as it does. There are no uncaused events, no gaps in the causal order, no room for will to intervene and make things different than they would otherwise have been. Every event follows necessarily from prior events according to the eternal laws that express God's nature. In the realm of extension, every physical event is caused by prior physical events. Your body moves because of prior states of your body and brain, which were caused by earlier states, which were caused by still earlier states, in an infinite chain of physical causation. At no point does some non-physical will intervene to change what would have happened anyway. The chain is complete and unbroken. In the realm of thought, every mental event is caused by prior mental events. Your decision to act follows necessarily from your desires, beliefs, and character, which were formed by prior experiences and ideas, which were determined by still earlier causes, in an infinite chain of mental causation. Your choices express your nature, but your nature itself is determined by causes outside your control. When you decide to do something, you are not acting freely in the sense of choosing between genuinely open alternatives. You are acting from the necessity of your own nature as shaped by all the causes that have formed you. You could not have decided otherwise given who you are and the circumstances you face. The decision feels free because you are aware of your desires and deliberations, but unaware of all the causes that determine them. This is what Spinoza meant by his famous statement. Men believe themselves to be free because they are conscious of their actions and ignorant of the causes whereby those actions are determined. We experience wanting, choosing, and acting, but we do not perceive the vast network of prior causes that made these mental events inevitable. The illusion of freedom arises from ignorance of causation, not from actual independence from causal determination. Spinoza illustrated this with a vivid metaphor. Imagine a stone flying through the air, and suppose it were conscious. The stone would feel its motion and might believe it flies freely, choosing its own trajectory, but the stone's motion is entirely determined by the force that launched it and the physical laws governing projectiles. Its feeling of freedom would be pure illusion, arising from ignorance of the causes that determine its path. We are like that stone, conscious of our motion but ignorant of what determines it. This denial of free will seems to have devastating implications for morality and responsibility. If we cannot help what we do, how can we be praised or blamed for our actions? How can there be genuine right and wrong if everyone simply acts from necessity? How can we justify punishing criminals if they could not have acted otherwise? Spinoza addresses these concerns, but his answers are unconventional. Moral praise and blame, he argues, are themselves determined responses to actions. When we praise someone, we are not asserting that they freely chose to be good, but expressing our approval and encouraging similar behavior. When we blame someone, we are not asserting they could have acted otherwise, but expressing disapproval and discouraging such behavior. These responses are natural and inevitable parts of how humans interact. They do not require free will to be appropriate or effective. Punishment can be justified not as retribution for freely chosen wrongdoing, but as protection for society and as a cause that might determine the criminal to act differently in the future. We punish not because people could have done otherwise, but because punishment is one of the causes that shapes future behavior. The criminal justice system becomes a system of causes aimed at preventing harmful behavior, rather than a system of moral retribution for freely chosen evil. Right and wrong, likewise, can be understood without appeal to free will. An action is right if it contributes to human flourishing and wrong if it hinders it. These judgments do not require that the person could have acted otherwise. They describe the objective relationship between actions and human welfare, a relationship that exists whether or not free will exists. This reconception of morality may seem to lower its status, to reduce ethical judgments to mere preferences or practical calculations. But Spinoza would argue that it raises morality's status by grounding it in objective facts about human nature and welfare, rather than in arbitrary divine commands or metaphysically mysterious free choices. Ethics becomes a science of what actually contributes to human flourishing, discoverable through reason and observation. Yet Spinoza does not want us simply to accept our determination passively. While we cannot escape causal necessity, we can change which causes determine us. We can transform ourselves from being determined primarily by external causes and passive emotions to being determined primarily by our own rational nature and active understanding. This transformation is what Spinoza means by freedom. True freedom is not exemption from causation, but self-determination, acting from one's own nature rather than being pushed around by external forces. A person driven by unconsidered passions, reacting to whatever stimuli present themselves, changing direction with every wind of circumstance, is a slave even though they believe themselves free. A person who acts from rational understanding of their own nature and situation, whose actions express their considered judgment rather than passing impulses, achieves a kind of freedom even though their actions are fully determined. The free person is not uncaused, but self-caused, determined by their own rational nature rather than by external pressures. This freedom must be achieved through understanding. When we understand that we are determined, when we grasp the causes that shape our desires and actions, when we comprehend how we fit into the larger causal order of nature, we can begin to live more rationally. Understanding itself becomes a cause that can compete with and sometimes overcome the passive emotions that would otherwise determine us. The person who understands. Necessity is determined by that understanding, and this determination is freedom in the only sense that matters. Spinoza also argues that accepting determinism leads to greater peace of mind. When we believe in free will, we torment ourselves with regrets about past choices and anxiety about future decisions. We blame ourselves excessively for failures and take inappropriate pride in successes. We hate others for wrongs they have done and fear what they might freely choose to do to us. All this mental suffering arises from the illusion that things could have been otherwise. When we understand that everything happens by necessity, we can let go of regret, self-blame, hatred, and anxiety. We can accept what has happened and what will happen with equanimity. We can respond to circumstances intelligently without the added burden of believing we or others could have made everything different through better choices. This acceptance is not resignation or passivity, but clear-sighted understanding of how reality actually works. The denial of free will thus leads paradoxically to a kind of liberation. We are freed from the tyranny of believing we should have been different, from the false responsibility of thinking everything depends on our choices, from the illusion that we are separate from nature and its laws. We can accept ourselves as we are, part of the natural order, subject to its laws, but capable through understanding of achieving the only freedom that actually exists: rational self-determination. Part 4. The Emotions and Human Bondage. Spinoza's analysis of the emotions is one of the most original and powerful parts of his philosophy. He approached the passions not as moral failures to be condemned, or mysterious forces to be feared, but as natural phenomena to be understood scientifically. The emotions follow from the same necessity as everything else in nature. They can be comprehended through reason, just as we comprehend geometry or physics. Understanding the emotions is the key to overcoming their tyranny and achieving rational freedom. Spinoza began with a simple and powerful insight. We are finite modes immersed in an infinite universe of other finite modes that constantly affect us. Our power of acting is constantly increased or diminished by our interactions with other things. When something increases our power of acting, we experience joy. When something decreases our power, we experience sadness. These are the two fundamental emotions from which all others derive. Joy is the transition to greater perfection, greater power, greater being. Sadness is the transition to lesser perfection, lesser power, lesser being. All other emotions are variations or combinations of these fundamental affects, combined with ideas about what causes them. Love is joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause. We love what we believe increases our power. Hate is sadness accompanied by the idea of an external cause. We hate what we believe decreases our power. Desire is our very essence, insofar as it is determined to do something by any given affection. These three, joy, sadness, and desire, are the primitive emotions from which all others flow. Hope is inconstant joy arising from an idea of something future whose outcome we doubt. Fear is inconstant sadness arising from an idea of something future whose outcome we doubt. Confidence is joy arising from an idea of something future or past, about which there is no cause for doubt. Despair is sadness arising from something about which we have been in doubt. From these basic emotions, Spinoza derives the entire complex landscape of human emotional life: shame, pride, pity, envy, gratitude, indignation, self-love, humility, ambition, and dozens more. Each is defined precisely in terms of the primitive emotions and the ideas that accompany them. This creates a systematic understanding of the passions as natural phenomena governed by comprehensible laws. But most of our emotional life involves what Spinoza calls passive emotions or passions. These are emotions that happen to us, determined by external causes rather than by our own rational nature. When we feel joy because something pleasant happens to us, we are passive, affected by external circumstances beyond our control. When we feel sadness because of some misfortune, we are passive, suffering rather than acting. Our emotional state is determined by what happens to us rather than by our own understanding and reasoning. This passivity is what Spinoza calls human bondage. We are in bondage to our emotions when they are determined by external causes and when they push us to act in ways contrary to reason. The person dominated by passive emotions is not free but enslaved, blown about by every wind of circumstance, reactive rather than active, suffering rather than flourishing. The bondage of the passions takes many forms. We desire things that harm us because they provide immediate pleasure while causing long-term damage. We hate people who have diminished our power, even when that hatred itself further diminishes us. We fear outcomes that we cannot control, suffering in imagination from evils that may never occur. We hope for benefits that depend on fortune rather than on our own efforts, setting ourselves up for disappointment. We take pride in accomplishments that are actually due to favorable circumstances, setting ourselves up for shame when circumstances change. Worse, our passive emotions often conflict with each other, tearing us in different directions. We desire something that we also fear. We love someone we also hate. We take pride in qualities we are also ashamed of. This internal conflict creates psychological suffering that compounds the suffering caused by external circumstances. We are at war with ourselves, different emotions battling for control of our behavior. Spinoza illustrated the power of passive emotions with stark clarity. An emotion can only be restrained or destroyed by another emotion contrary thereto, and with more power for restraining emotion. Reason alone cannot overcome passion. Knowing that something is harmful does not prevent us from desiring it, if the desire is strong enough. Understanding that fear is irrational does not eliminate the fear. We can know what we should do and still find ourselves unable to do it because contrary emotions overwhelm our rational judgment. This leads to a pessimistic assessment of human nature in its ordinary condition. Most people are ruled by passive emotions most of the time. They react to circumstances rather than acting from understanding. They are pushed around by desires they did not choose and emotions they cannot control. They suffer unnecessarily from fears, hatreds, envies, and disappointments that arise from inadequate understanding of themselves and their situation. Human life, for most people, is bondage to forces they neither understand nor control. But Spinoza's analysis of the emotions is not ultimately pessimistic because he also shows the path to freedom. Passive emotions can be transformed into active emotions through understanding. An emotion that is a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. When we understand why we feel what we feel, when we grasp the causes of our emotions and their place in the causal order of nature, the emotions themselves change character. They become active rather than passive, expressions of our own rational nature rather than effects of external causes. Consider fear of death. Most people fear death with a powerful passive emotion that poisons their enjoyment of life and makes them cowardly and servile. But when we understand that death is necessary and natural, that it is simply the dissolution of the finite mode we temporarily constitute, that fearing it accomplishes nothing except to diminish our present power and happiness, the character of the emotion changes. We may still prefer life to death, but the preference is rational rather than passionate. It does not dominate our thoughts or constrain our behavior. We are freed from bondage to the fear. Similarly with other emotions. When we understand that hatred diminishes our own power regardless of what it does to its object, we can overcome hatred through reason. When we understand that envy is based on comparing our circumstances to others rather than on assessing our objective situation, we can overcome envy. When we understand that excessive pride and shame both arise from inadequate understanding of causation and our place in nature, we can achieve a more balanced self-assessment. The transformation of passive emotions into active ones is not easy or quick. It requires sustained effort to understand ourselves, to trace the causes of our feelings, to see clearly how our emotions arise from our interactions with the world. It requires developing the strength of mind to live according to understanding, rather than according to passion. Most people never achieve this freedom, remaining in bondage to their emotions throughout their lives. But for those willing to make the effort, Spinoza offers a path to liberation. We can transform ourselves from passive reactors to active agents, from beings determined primarily by external causes to beings determined primarily by our own rational nature. This transformation is what Spinoza calls blessedness or salvation, and it is available to anyone through the power of understanding. Part 5. Adequate Ideas and the Intellectual Love of God. The key to escaping bondage and achieving freedom in Spinoza's philosophy is developing adequate ideas. An adequate idea is one that follows from the power of the mind alone, not from external causes. It is a clear and distinct understanding of something through its causes and its necessary relations to other things. Adequate ideas are active rather than passive, expressions of our own rational power rather than mere effects of external stimulation. Inadequate ideas are fragmentary, confused, arising from our limited perspective, as finite modes affected by countless external causes we do not understand. When we perceive something through our senses without understanding its causes or its place in the larger order of nature, we have inadequate ideas. These ideas are not completely false, but they are partial and confused, mixing up how things affect us with how things are in themselves. Most of human suffering arises from inadequate ideas. We fear what we do not understand. We desire things based on confused perceptions of what will benefit us. We react emotionally to situations without grasping their causes or necessity. Our inadequate ideas generate passive emotions that dominate our behavior and diminish our power. The path to freedom requires replacing inadequate ideas with adequate ones. Spinoza distinguished 3 levels or kinds of knowledge, each corresponding to a different relationship between mind and reality. The first kind of knowledge comes from random experience and from vague images and signs. This is how we know most things in daily life, through sensory perception, through hearing testimony, through forming associations based on repeated experiences. This knowledge is adequate for practical purposes but is confused and partial. It gives us knowledge of effects without knowledge of causes, knowledge of how things appear to us without knowledge of their nature. The second kind of knowledge comes from reason, from understanding things through their common properties, and through adequate ideas of the attributes of things. This is scientific and mathematical knowledge, understanding through general laws and necessary connections. When we comprehend how things must be related because they share certain properties or fall under certain laws, we achieve the second kind of knowledge. This knowledge is adequate and active, an expression of our own rational power. The third and highest kind of knowledge Spinoza calls intuitive science or scientia intuitiva. This is direct intellectual perception of how particular things follow from the eternal and infinite essence of God. It is seeing the necessity of particular facts as expressions of God's nature, understanding individual things sub specie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. This highest knowledge combines the concreteness of the first kind with the necessity of the second, achieving understanding of particular things as necessary expressions of infinite substance. The progression from the first to the second to the third kind of knowledge is the path of liberation. As we replace inadequate ideas with adequate ones, as we move from confused perception to rational understanding to intuitive comprehension of necessity, we transform ourselves. Our emotions become active rather than passive. Our actions express our own nature rather than responding to external stimuli. We achieve freedom through understanding necessity. This culminates in what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis. When we understand particular things as following necessarily from God's nature, when we comprehend the eternal necessity of existence, we experience a distinctive joy. This joy is not passive, not dependent on external circumstances, but active, arising from our own power of understanding. It is necessarily accompanied by the idea of God as cause. This constitutes love of God, but a very different love from what traditional religion imagines. The intellectual love of God is not love of a person who might love us back or care about our welfare. It is love of the necessary order of nature, delight in understanding how everything fits together, joy in comprehending our place in the infinite whole. This love is eternal and immune to the fluctuations of fortune, because it does not depend on circumstances, but on understanding. Once achieved, it cannot be lost, except through loss of the understanding itself. Spinoza makes the remarkable claim that the mind's intellectual love of God is part of the infinite love with which God loves himself. Our understanding is God's self-understanding occurring through the finite mode we constitute. Our joy in understanding is God's joy in his own nature, expressed through our limited perspective. When we achieve adequate understanding, we participate in God's infinite intellect. The boundary between our mind and God's mind becomes permeable. This participation in God's infinite intellect is the closest Spinoza comes to offering a form of immortality. The mind, insofar as it understands things under the aspect of eternity, is eternal. The adequate ideas we form do not perish with the body because they are not dependent on the body's particular state. They are eternal truths about the necessary nature of things. When we understand such truths, something in us partakes of eternity. This is not personal immortality in the traditional sense. The aspect of mind that is eternal is not our individual personality, our memories and particular experiences, but our capacity for adequate understanding. When the body dies, this understanding does not continue as an individual consciousness, but returns to the infinite intellect from which it was never really separate. It is immortality of a sort, but impersonal and merging with the divine rather than preserving individual identity. The practical implication of this metaphysics is clear. We should devote ourselves to developing adequate ideas and achieving intuitive knowledge of God or nature. This is the path to freedom, to happiness, to blessedness. The person who understands necessity, who sees things as they must be, who comprehends their place in the eternal order, achieves a peace and satisfaction that does not depend on external circumstances and cannot be taken away by fortune. Spinoza writes with moving conviction about the rewards of this path. Blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. Nor do we rejoice therein because we control our lusts, but on the contrary, because we rejoice therein, we are able thereby to control our lusts. The joy of understanding is not something we achieve after we have conquered our passions. The joy itself is what gives us power to overcome passion. Blessedness is its own reward, available to anyone who makes the effort to understand. This vision of human fulfillment is austere but profound. It offers no easy consolations, no promises of personal survival, no assurance that the universe cares about human desires. But it offers something real, the possibility of understanding our place in necessity, of achieving freedom through comprehending determinism, of finding joy in knowledge itself. For Spinoza, this is enough. This must be enough. This is the highest happiness available to finite modes of infinite substance. Part 6. Ethics and the Guidance of Reason. Spinoza's ethics follows necessarily from his metaphysics and his understanding of the emotions. If we are finite modes of infinite substance, if our actions are determined by the same necessity that governs all nature, if freedom consists in acting from our own rational nature, rather than being pushed by external causes, then ethics becomes the science of what actually contributes to human flourishing and how we can achieve it. The foundation of Spinoza's ethics is a simple principle. Everything strives to persevere in its being. This is the famous Conatus doctrine. Each thing, by its very nature, endeavours to persist in existence and to increase its power of acting. This striving is not something separate from the thing's essence, but is identical with it. To exist is to strive to continue existing. This striving is not conscious deliberation or purposeful planning. A stone does not decide to preserve itself, but it does resist forces that would destroy it through its very nature as a stone. A plant grows toward light and extends roots toward water without conscious intention, but driven by its nature to maintain and expand its existence. In conscious beings, this striving appears as desire, as the conscious drive to preserve and enhance our being. Human beings, like all things, strive to persevere in their being and to increase their power. But we face a distinctive challenge. As conscious beings aware of many possible courses of action, we can pursue things that diminish our power while believing they increase it. We can be led astray by inadequate ideas and passive emotions into self-destructive behavior. We need guidance about what actually serves our conatus, our striving to persist and flourish. This guidance is what Spinoza means by ethics. Good and bad in Spinoza's system are not absolute properties things possess independently of their effects on us. Good is what we certainly know to be useful to us. Bad is what we certainly know prevents us from possessing some good. These definitions are radically subjective, but in a specific sense. Good and bad are relative to human nature and human needs. What is good for humans may be bad for other creatures and vice versa. But given human nature, we can determine objectively what serves human flourishing and what hinders it. The good life, the life according to reason, consists in acting in ways that truly increase our power and contribute to our genuine flourishing. This requires understanding our own nature, distinguishing real benefits from apparent ones, and acting on adequate ideas rather than passive emotions. The rational person seeks what truly benefits them rather than what merely seems beneficial to inadequate understanding. Spinoza argues that reason teaches that we should seek what is truly useful to ourselves. But what is truly useful? The most useful thing to human beings is other human beings who live according to reason. Humans are social creatures who can accomplish far more through cooperation than in isolation. But cooperation is stable and beneficial only when people act from reason rather than from conflicting passions. The rational person seeks community with other rational people, creating a society of mutually reinforcing rational actors. This leads to one of Spinoza's most important ethical principles. A man who is guided by reason is more free in a state where he lives under a general system of law than in solitude where he is independent. Freedom is not isolation or independence from others, but rational participation in a community governed by law. The person who lives alone may be independent, but is also weak, vulnerable, and limited. The person who lives in a rational community sacrifices some independence, but gains the far greater power that comes from cooperation. Several specific ethical guidelines follow from these principles. We should seek knowledge above all else, because knowledge increases our power more than anything else. Understanding how things actually work gives us the ability to interact with them effectively. The ignorant person is at the mercy of forces they do not comprehend. The wise person can navigate circumstances successfully because they understand the causes at work. We should control our emotions through understanding rather than through suppression. The person who tries to eliminate emotions through force of will fights a losing battle because the emotions arise from our nature as finite modes affected by countless external causes. But the person who transforms passive emotions into active ones through adequate understanding achieves lasting control without internal conflict. We should cultivate friendship and community with others who live by reason. The society of rational people reinforces each person's rationality and increases everyone's power. The society of people dominated by passion creates conflict and diminishes everyone. We should seek the company of the wise and avoid the company of those enslaved to their passions. We should accept what we cannot change with equanimity. Since everything happens by necessity, railing against necessity is futile and self-destructive. The rational person distinguishes what is in their power from what is not, working to improve what can be improved and accepting what cannot be changed without excessive emotional investment. We should practice what Spinoza calls generosity, acting from understanding to benefit others without expecting return. This is not altruism in the conventional sense, because the generous person acts from their own rational nature and increases their own power through benefiting others. But the benefit to others is real, and the generous person does not calculate expected returns. We should recognize that apparent conflicts of genuine interest are impossible. What truly benefits me cannot truly harm you because we are both finite modes of the same infinite substance. When we both act from reason, our interests converge rather than conflict. Apparent conflicts arise from inadequate ideas and passive emotions, from seeking things that do not truly benefit us, or from misunderstanding the situation. Spinoza's ethics contains no list of absolute commandments, no divine laws that must be obeyed regardless of circumstances. Every ethical guideline is instrumental, justified by its contribution to human flourishing and rational freedom. This makes his ethics consequentialist in a broad sense, but with a sophisticated understanding of consequences that includes not just external results, but the internal state of the person acting. The person who acts rightly from adequate understanding achieves internal benefits, increased power, greater freedom, deeper joy, regardless of external outcomes. This ethics demands a great deal. It requires sustained intellectual effort to develop adequate ideas. It requires honesty in examining our own motives and beliefs. It requires courage to face hard truths about ourselves and our situation. It requires patience in transforming passive emotions into active ones. It requires discipline in living according to reason rather than according to immediate impulse. Most people, Spinoza acknowledges, will never achieve this level of rational self-governance. But for those willing to make the effort, it offers a path to genuine flourishing, to freedom, to the highest happiness available to beings like us. The ethical life is the rational life, and the rational life is the life of understanding necessity and acting from one's own nature rather than being pushed by external causes and passive emotions. Part 7. Politics and the Free State. Spinoza's political philosophy emerges directly from his ethics and his understanding of human nature. If humans are finite modes striving to persevere in their being, if most people are dominated by passive emotions rather than guided by reason, if genuine freedom requires rational self-determination, then the question becomes, what form of political organization best serves human flourishing? The answer is not simple, because people are not primarily rational, but primarily passionate. The state cannot be designed for rational beings who do not yet exist, but must accommodate humans as they actually are, while creating conditions that might allow more people to achieve rationality. Spinoza begins with a realistic assessment of the state of nature, the condition of humans without political organization. In nature, every individual has as much right as they have power. Right and power are identical. We have the right to do whatever we can do, limited only by our actual capacity. This means the state of nature is a state of war, not because humans are inherently evil, but because our passionate natures lead to conflicts. When people are guided by passion rather than reason, their desires conflict. Each person seeks to increase their own power, but in ways that often diminish others. This creates instability and insecurity. No one is safe. No one can reliably pursue their long-term interests because they must constantly defend against immediate threats. Life in the state of nature is indeed solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes had argued, though Spinoza arrived at this conclusion through different reasoning. The solution is to form a political community in which individuals transfer some of their natural right to a sovereign power in exchange for security and order. This is the social contract, but Spinoza understands it differently than either Hobbes or Locke. The transfer of right is not absolute or irrevocable. It persists only so long as the sovereign actually provides the security and conditions for flourishing that justified the transfer. If the sovereign fails in this function, the contract dissolves, and individuals reclaim their natural right. The sovereign power, whether one person or an assembly, holds authority only to the extent that it actually possesses the power to govern. Authority and power remain identical. A sovereign who loses the ability to command obedience loses the right to command. This makes all government ultimately dependent on the consent and support of the governed, though that consent may be passive or active, rational or passionate. Spinoza's preference is for democratic government, which he defines as a society which wields all its power as a whole. In a democracy, sovereignty rests with the people collectively, not with a monarch or aristocratic elite. This is the most natural form of government because it most clearly reflects the fact that political power ultimately derives from the collective power of individuals. It is also the form most consistent with human equality and most conducive to rational freedom. But Spinoza recognizes that democracy can fail if the people are dominated by passionate rather than rational thinking. A democracy of passionate people can be tyrannical, unstable, and destructive. The challenge is to design political institutions that channel passionate motivations in beneficial directions while creating space for rational individuals to flourish. Key to this is freedom of thought and expression. Spinoza was one of the earliest and strongest defenders of intellectual freedom, arguing that the state has no right or power to control what people think or say. Our thoughts are private and cannot be controlled by external force. Attempting to suppress opinion creates resentment and rebellion without actually changing beliefs. Moreover, a diversity of opinions improves collective judgment by exposing errors and revealing new truths. The free state tolerates and even encourages public debate on all topics, including religion and politics. This does not mean absolute freedom of action. The state can regulate behavior to prevent harm and maintain order. But it cannot legitimately suppress the expression of ideas, no matter how unconventional or disturbing those ideas may be. The person who thinks and speaks freely while obeying the law is more useful to the state than the person who silently resents restrictions on thought. Spinoza's defense of toleration extends explicitly to religious diversity. Different religions are different ways of imagining the divine and motivating ethical behavior through hope and fear. No religion possesses absolute truth. All are mixtures of adequate and inadequate ideas. The state should tolerate all religions that promote social peace and ethical behavior, while suppressing none for their doctrinal content. This was a radical position in 17th century Europe, where religious uniformity was considered essential to political stability. Spinoza argued the opposite. Religious persecution creates instability, while toleration promotes peace. People of different faiths can live together harmoniously if the state does not take sides in their theological disputes. The purpose of the state is not to transform people into rational sages, but to create conditions in which people can pursue their own conception of the good life in security. The state provides external order so that individuals can develop internal order. It prevents the passionate conflicts that would arise in the state of nature, while allowing space for those capable of rationality to achieve it. The best state is not the one that makes people virtuous, but the one that allows virtue to develop naturally while constraining vice from harming others. Spinoza also emphasizes the importance of law as opposed to arbitrary rule. The rule of law, where fixed and public rules determine what is permitted and forbidden, provides predictability and security. People can plan their lives and pursue their interests, knowing what is expected of them. Arbitrary rule, where the sovereign's will determines outcomes case by case, creates uncertainty and dependence. Even a benevolent dictator who generally acts wisely exercises arbitrary power that could turn tyrannical. The state should also promote education and culture because these develop people's rational capacities and reduce their bondage to passion. A well-educated populace is more capable of self-governance and less likely to be manipulated by demagogues. Investment in education serves the state's interest in stability and the individual's interest in freedom. These political principles led Spinoza to support the republican government of the Dutch Republic against the House of Orange's monarchical ambitions. He saw republican government, with its distributed power and protections for liberty, as more consistent with human nature and more conducive to flourishing than monarchy. His political writings defended religious toleration, freedom of expression, and democratic participation at a time when such views were dangerously radical. The ultimate goal of political organization is to create a free state where rational individuals can flourish and where even those dominated by passion can live securely and peacefully. Such a state is not utopian fantasy, but practical necessity, the form of organization that best serves human nature as it actually exists. The free state provides the external conditions for internal freedom, the social framework within which individuals can pursue the personal transformation from bondage to blessedness. Part 8. Religion and the theological political problem. Spinoza's relationship with religion is complex and has been subject to radically different interpretations. Some see him as a crypto-atheist who disguised his materialism in theological language to avoid persecution. Others see him as a deeply religious thinker who sought to purify religion of superstition and anthropomorphism. The truth likely lies between these extremes. Spinoza was certainly not religious in any conventional sense, but he was also not simply irreligious. He was trying to reconstitute the relationship between philosophy and religion on entirely new foundations. Traditional religion, in Spinoza's analysis, is based on inadequate ideas. It imagines God as a person with intellect and will who created the world by choice, who cares about human affairs, who issues commandments and responds to prayers, who rewards virtue and punishes vice. All of this is projection of human characteristics onto nature, anthropomorphism that mistakes God for a magnified human being. This conception of God arises naturally from inadequate ideas. When we do not understand the causes of natural phenomena, we attribute them to divine will. When we do not understand our own emotions and desires, we imagine God experiences similar states. When we do not grasp the necessity that governs all things, we imagine that God acts from free choice as we believe we do. Religion based on these inadequate ideas serves important social functions. It motivates ethical behavior through hope for reward and fear of punishment. It provides comfort in suffering through the belief that God cares about human welfare. It creates community through shared rituals and beliefs. For people incapable of understanding philosophical truth, religion provides accessible moral guidance. But religion also causes tremendous harm. Different religions conflict, each claiming unique access to divine truth, leading to persecution, war, and cruelty justified by piety. Religion suppresses rational inquiry by declaring certain questions off-limits and certain beliefs mandatory. It encourages passivity and submission rather than active rational self-determination. It diverts energy from genuine understanding to empty ritual and dogma. Spinoza's solution is to separate religion from philosophy completely. Philosophy seeks truth through reason and should be free to pursue inquiry wherever it leads, without constraint from religious authority. Religion seeks to motivate obedience to ethical principles through appeals to imagination and emotion, and should be free to do so without interference from philosophy. The two serve different functions and should not conflict. Religion, properly understood, has one single teaching: justice and charity. All the theological doctrines, the stories about creation and miracles, the descriptions of God's nature and will, are not essential to religion, but are imaginative vehicles for conveying this ethical message. What matters is not whether someone believes the right theological propositions, but whether they act with justice and love toward others. Spinoza interprets Scripture according to this principle. The Bible is not a philosophical textbook or a source of scientific knowledge. It is a book designed to motivate ordinary people to ethical behavior through stories, commandments, and promises of reward. It should be read as serving this function, rather than as revealing metaphysical truths. The contradictions and impossibilities in Scripture do not undermine its value, because its value lies in its ethical message, not in its theoretical content. This leads to one of Spinoza's most controversial claims. Christ was not the unique Son of God, or the sole source of salvation, but the supreme example of wisdom and virtue. Christ understood God's nature more adequately than the prophets who received confused imaginative visions. Christ taught the essential message of justice and charity, freed from excessive ritual and legalism. But Christianity became corrupted when the Church transformed this simple ethical teaching into elaborate theological dogma backed by institutional authority. The institutional Church, in Spinoza's view, is one of the main obstacles to both rational freedom and genuine religion. It claims authority over conscience, demanding belief in propositions that contradict reason. It persecutes dissenters in the name of protecting orthodoxy. It allies with political power to enforce conformity. It replaces the simple teaching of justice and charity with complex theology accessible only to educated elites. Reformed religion, the Protestantism of Spinoza's context, improved on Catholicism by reducing priestly mediation and emphasizing individual conscience. But it remained flawed by insisting on theological correctness and by intolerance toward dissent. True religion requires going further, abandoning all theological dogma and retaining only the ethical core. Spinoza envisions a minimal universal religion consisting only of belief in God's existence, God's uniqueness, God's omnipresence, God's supreme right over all things, worship of God consisting in justice and charity, salvation through obedience to God in these terms, and God's forgiveness of the repentant. Everything else, all the specific theological doctrines that divide religions from each other, is inessential. Different religions can be understood as different imaginative presentations of these universal truths, adapted to different cultures and circumstances. The political implications are clear. The state should enforce only the minimal ethical requirements of justice and charity, while tolerating all theological diversity. No one should be persecuted for their beliefs about God's nature or the afterlife. No church should have the power to compel belief or punish heresy. Religion should be a private matter of individual conscience, with public expression limited to ethical conduct. This position was enormously radical in 17th century Europe, where religious uniformity was considered essential to political order. Spinoza's theological political treatise, published anonymously but quickly attributed to him, was condemned by religious authorities across the theological spectrum. It was banned, burned, and denounced as atheistic and seditious. The scandal contributed to Spinoza's isolation and poverty. But Spinoza believed the argument was necessary. The alliance between religious intolerance and political tyranny threatened both intellectual freedom and peace. Breaking this alliance required showing that religion properly understood neither requires nor supports theological dogmatism or persecution. True religion is compatible with philosophical freedom because they operate in different domains and serve different functions. This reconception of religion eliminates the God of traditional theology, the personal deity who creates, commands, judges, and intervenes. But it replaces this God with something Spinoza believed was higher and truer: God or nature, the infinite substance that exists necessarily and produces everything according to eternal laws. This God deserves intellectual love rather than fear and obedience. Understanding this God's nature is the highest achievement of human reason and the source of genuine blessedness. Whether this reconception constitutes religion at all or is simply atheism disguised in religious language remains debated. Spinoza certainly did not believe in a personal God who cares about human affairs. But he also did not reduce reality to dead matter in motion. He affirmed an infinite substance that is both physical and mental, that necessarily exists, that can be understood and loved. This is God enough for Spinoza, even if it is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Part 9. The Mind-Body Problem and Parallelism. One of Spinoza's most ingenious contributions to philosophy is his solution to the mind-body problem. How can mind and body interact if they are fundamentally different kinds of things? How can immaterial thoughts cause physical movements or physical sensations cause mental experiences? This problem plagued Cartesian dualism and generated various attempted solutions, none fully satisfactory. Spinoza dissolved the problem by denying its fundamental assumption. Mind and body are not two different things that somehow interact. They are the same thing considered under different attributes. Every finite mode has both a mental aspect and a physical aspect. These are not separate entities, but parallel expressions of a single underlying reality. The human mind is the idea of the human body. The body is a mode of extension, a physical thing with location, shape, motion, and rest. The mind is a mode of thought, an idea whose object is that physical body. Mind and body are not two substances or two modes, but one mode considered under two different attributes. They are the same reality described in two different languages. This elegant solution eliminates the interaction problem completely. Mind and body do not interact because they are not separate things that could interact. There is only one sequence of events with two aspects. When you decide to raise your arm and your arm rises, there are not two events with a causal connection between them. There is one event that can be described either mentally, a decision, or physically, neural activity leading to muscle contraction. The mental description and the physical description are equally complete and equally accurate. Neither is more fundamental than the other. Neither causes the other. They are parallel accounts of the same occurrence, like two translations of the same text into different languages. This is the doctrine of psychophysical parallelism. For every mental event there is a corresponding physical event, and vice versa. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. A chain of thoughts corresponds exactly to a chain of physical events in the brain. The two run in perfect parallel because they are not actually two but one. This parallelism is not contingent or miraculous, but necessary. It follows from the nature of substance and attributes. Extension and thought are both attributes of the same substance. Everything that happens in substance can be expressed through either attribute. The parallel is perfect because the same events are being described from different perspectives. Spinoza's solution is more radical than occasionalism, which maintained that God causes mental and physical events separately to coordinate. It is more radical than pre-established harmony, which imagined God winding up mind and body like synchronized clocks. Spinoza denies that there are two separate streams that need coordinating. There is one stream described in two ways. This has important implications for psychology and neuroscience. Mental events are not epiphenomenal, mere byproducts of physical processes without causal efficacy. Mental descriptions are as real and as complete as physical descriptions. A psychological explanation of behavior and a neurological explanation are not competing accounts, but complementary perspectives. Neither is reducible to the other, because each expresses the same reality through a different attribute. It also means that everything mental has a physical correlate, and everything physical has a mental correlate. Every thought corresponds to some brain state. Every brain state corresponds to some mental content, though much of this content may be unconscious or inaccessible to introspection. The mind extends exactly as far as the body, no further and no less. Since the human body is enormously complex, composed of countless simpler bodies in intricate organization, the human mind is correspondingly complex. It is not a simple unity but a composite idea reflecting the composite nature of the body. The mind includes ideas of all the parts and processes of the body, though most of these ideas remain confused and unconscious. We are aware of some mental content, our conscious thoughts and experiences. But vast regions of mental life remain hidden, corresponding to bodily processes we do not consciously perceive. This anticipates modern understanding of the unconscious, the recognition that consciousness is only a small part of mental life, and that much psychological causation operates below the threshold of awareness. Spinoza's parallelism also applies beyond humans to all of nature. Every physical thing has a mental correlate. Even a stone has an idea that is its mental aspect. This is not to say that stones are conscious or that they think. Consciousness and thought require complexity of organization that stones lack. But there is some mental aspect to even the simplest physical things, some way that they exist not only as extended things, but also as ideas in God's infinite intellect. This panpsychism, or neutral monism, is not mystical obscurantism, but follows logically from Spinoza's metaphysics. If thought and extension are parallel attributes of the one substance, if everything that exists in one attribute has a correlate in the other, then everything physical has some mental aspect. The universe is not dead matter, accidentally giving rise to consciousness in complex organisms. The universe is inherently both physical and mental, with consciousness emerging as a complex form of the mentality that exists everywhere in simpler forms. The practical upshot for understanding ourselves is that we must attend to both mental and physical aspects of our nature. Trying to understand human beings purely psychologically or purely physiologically will fail because each perspective is incomplete. We are embodied minds or ensouled bodies, and our flourishing requires attending to both aspects of our unified nature. This also means that mental health and physical health are not separate. Depression is simultaneously a mental state and a physical state, one occurrence with two aspects. Treating only one aspect while ignoring the other will be less effective than addressing both. The mind can affect the body not through mysterious interaction, but through the fact that they are the same thing described differently. Mental practices like meditation or cognitive therapy have physical effects because mental changes are physical changes viewed from a different perspective. Spinoza's solution to the mind-body problem has been both influential and controversial. Some see it as dissolving a pseudo-problem by showing that mind and body are not really distinct. Others see it as merely restating the problem in different language without truly solving it. But the doctrine of parallelism remains one of the most sophisticated attempts to preserve both the integrity of mental life and the completeness of physical causation without reducing one to the other or splitting reality into unbridgeable domains. Part 10. Freedom through understanding necessity. The apparent paradox at the heart of Spinoza's ethics is that we achieve freedom by understanding that we are not free in the conventional sense. We escape bondage by accepting necessity. We become self-determining by comprehending determinism. This seems contradictory until we grasp what Spinoza means by freedom and how understanding relates to it. Conventional freedom, freedom of indifference, is the supposed ability to choose between alternatives that are equally possible. When I deliberate about whether to stay or go, I believe both options are genuinely open, and that my choice determines which becomes actual. I could choose either, and my choice makes the difference. This is the freedom we ordinarily attribute to ourselves and celebrate as the foundation of responsibility and dignity. Spinoza denies that any such freedom exists. Our choices are determined by our character, our beliefs, our desires, and our circumstances, all of which were shaped by prior causes beyond our control. The feeling of freedom in deliberation is an illusion arising from our awareness of the alternatives we consider, but ignorance of the causes that make one alternative necessary. The experience of choosing is real, but the metaphysical freedom we attribute to it is not. But there is another kind of freedom that is real and achievable: rational self-determination. This is acting from one's own nature, from adequate understanding, rather than being pushed by external causes and passive emotions. The person who acts from reason is free, even though their actions are determined because they are determined by their own rational nature, rather than by external forces. Consider two people who both refrain from stealing. One refrains from fear of punishment. Their restraint is determined by external force, by the threat the state poses to thieves. If the threat were removed, they would steal. They are not free, but coerced, acting against their desire due to external pressure. The other refrains from rational understanding that stealing harms both victims and thieves by undermining social trust and cooperation. Their restraint flows from their own nature and judgment. Even if all external punishment were removed, they would still refrain because stealing contradicts their rational understanding. They are free because they act from their own nature. Both actions are determined. Neither person could have acted otherwise given who they are and their circumstances. But one is determined by external causes and passive emotions, while the other is determined by internal rationality and adequate understanding. This difference is the difference between bondage and freedom, between slavery to passion and rational self-determination. Achieving this freedom requires transforming ourselves from passive reactors to active understanders. This transformation happens through developing adequate ideas about ourselves, our emotions, our circumstances, and our place in the larger order of nature. As we understand more adequately, we become more active and more free. The process is gradual and difficult. We cannot simply decide to be rational and instantly overcome passionate determination. Our passions are powerful causes rooted in our nature as finite modes constantly affected by external forces. Reason must compete with passion using the only weapon it has: the power of true ideas. A true idea has intrinsic power. When we genuinely understand something, that understanding itself becomes a cause influencing our behavior. Understanding that fear of death diminishes our present power does not immediately eliminate the fear, but it weakens it. Understanding that hatred harms us regardless of its effects on its object gradually reduces hatred's hold. Understanding that many of our desires are based on inadequate ideas and do not truly serve our interests allows us to resist them. The transformation requires sustained effort. We must actively seek understanding, examining our beliefs and emotions, tracing their causes, considering them in relation to the whole of nature. We must practice viewing things under the aspect of eternity, seeing particular occurrences as necessary expressions of universal laws rather than as contingent misfortunes. We must cultivate the intellectual habits that generate adequate ideas. As understanding grows, it changes our emotional life. Passive emotions become active as we comprehend their causes and necessity. Fear transforms into rational caution. Hatred transforms into clear-eyed recognition of opposition without the emotional suffering hatred brings. Excessive hope and disappointment give way to realistic assessment and steady effort. We become less reactive and more stable. This stability is not passivity or resignation, but the active peace that comes from understanding. The person who understands necessity is not crushed by it, but empowered. They do not waste energy fighting what cannot be changed. They focus on what lies within their power, their own understanding, and the actions that flow from it. This is the freedom Spinoza offers. Not exemption from causation or escape from nature, but active participation in the very necessity that governs all things. We are not separate from nature, masters who might control it through will. We are part of nature, finite expressions of infinite substance. Our freedom consists in understanding our nature and acting according to it rather than against it. This understanding culminates in what Spinoza calls the third kind of knowledge, scientia intuitiva, which sees particular things as following necessarily from God's eternal nature. When we understand why things must be as they are, when we comprehend how our own existence and experience flow from the infinite substance, we achieve the intellectual love of God. This love is our highest freedom and our deepest happiness. It is active rather than passive, necessary rather than contingent, eternal rather than temporary. The freedom Spinoza describes is available only to those who make the effort to achieve adequate understanding. Most people will remain in bondage to passive emotions, pushed by external causes, reactive rather than active. The path to freedom is difficult, and few will complete it. But for those willing to try, freedom through understanding necessity represents the highest human achievement. The transformation from finite mode, blindly determined by external causes, to finite mode, consciously participating in the necessity of infinite substance. Part 11. The Eternity of the Mind. Spinoza's doctrine of the mind's eternity is one of the most difficult and controversial aspects of his philosophy. It appears to offer a form of immortality, yet it is radically different from traditional religious conceptions. It is grounded in rigorous metaphysical reasoning, yet its meaning remains elusive and subject to widely varying interpretations. Understanding what Spinoza means requires careful attention to his technical terminology and his understanding of eternity versus duration. Eternity, for Spinoza, is not infinite duration, not lasting forever in time. Eternity is existence outside time altogether, existence that is not temporal but necessary. God exists eternally, which means God exists necessarily, not that God endures through infinite time. Eternal truths like mathematical theorems are eternal because they do not come into existence or pass out of existence. They are timelessly true. Human beings ordinarily exist in duration, in time. We are born at a particular moment, live for a span of years, and die. Our existence is temporary, bounded by beginning and end. Our experiences occur in temporal sequence. Our bodies change constantly, aging and eventually disintegrating. This is existence in duration, temporal existence. But Spinoza argues that there is an aspect of the human mind that exists eternally, not temporally. The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains which is eternal. What is this eternal aspect of mind? It is the mind insofar as it conceives things under the aspect of eternity, a sub specie aeternitatis. When we understand eternal truths, when we grasp necessary connections, when we comprehend how things follow from God's nature, we participate in eternity. These adequate ideas are not temporal events in consciousness, but eternal features of God's infinite intellect. Spinoza's reasoning is subtle. The mind is the idea of the body. Most of this idea involves understanding the body as it exists in duration, as it changes through time. This temporal understanding perishes with the body because it is the idea of something temporal. When the body ceases to exist in time, the temporal idea of it ceases as well. But the mind also can conceive the body and other things under the aspect of eternity, as following necessarily from God's nature. This eternal understanding is not temporal and does not depend on the body's temporal existence. It is an eternal truth about how this particular body follows from infinite substance. This eternal truth does not come into being or pass out of being. It is eternally true that this body follows from God's nature in this particular way. The eternal aspect of mind is not individual personality, not memories or particular experiences, not consciousness as we ordinarily know it. It is the adequate understanding we achieve of eternal truths, including the truth of how our own existence follows necessarily from infinite substance. When we achieve such understanding, we participate in God's eternal knowledge. Our mind, insofar as it understands adequately, is part of God's infinite intellect. This eternal aspect does not survive bodily death as a continuing or consciousness. It is not personal immortality in any conventional sense. The individual personality, the sense of being a separate self persisting through time, perishes completely. What remains is the eternal truth of how this finite mode expressed infinite substance, a truth that was always eternal and never temporal. Some interpreters see this doctrine as offering genuine consolation. Even though I will die and my individual consciousness will end, something of me participates in eternity. The adequate understanding I achieve is eternally part of God's infinite intellect. This is a kind of immortality, albeit impersonal and merged with the divine. Other interpreters see the doctrine as essentially empty. If what survives is not my consciousness or personality, if I will not experience anything after death, then in what meaningful sense does something of me remain? The eternal truth about my existence exists whether or not I understand it. Achieving adequate understanding during life may be valuable, but it does not change what happens at death. I cease to exist as completely as if I had never understood anything. Spinoza himself suggests that the eternal aspect of mind is experienced during life, not after death. He who possesses a body capable of the greatest number of activities possesses a mind whereof the greatest part is eternal. The more adequate understanding we achieve, the more we participate in eternity while alive. This participation is experienced as the intellectual love of God, as blessedness, as the highest form of human happiness. The value lies in the present experience of eternity, not in future survival. Moreover, understanding the mind's eternity transforms our attitude toward death. When we comprehend that we are finite modes of infinite substance, that our existence is necessary though temporary, that something of us participates in eternity through adequate understanding, death becomes less fearful. We accept it as natural and necessary, as the dissolution of the finite mode we temporarily constitute. The free person thinks of nothing less than of death, and their wisdom is a meditation on life, not death. Death is not to be feared or obsessed over, but accepted as the natural end of temporal existence. The focus should be on living well, on achieving adequate understanding and rational freedom while we exist in duration. This life is all we have as individual consciousnesses, and we should make the most of it rather than pining for an impossible personal immortality. The doctrine of the mind's eternity thus serves primarily an ethical function. It encourages us to develop adequate understanding and to achieve the intellectual love of God. It transforms our relationship to mortality from fear and denial to acceptance and present focus. It offers a form of immortality through participation in eternal truth, even if this immortality is not personal survival. Whether Spinoza himself believed in something more, some continuing consciousness or experience after death, remains unclear. His language is carefully ambiguous, perhaps deliberately so. He may have believed that adequate understanding somehow continues after bodily death in ways he could not fully articulate. Or he may have believed that talk of the mind's eternity is just a way of describing participation in timeless truth during temporal life. What is clear is that Spinoza's doctrine breaks completely with traditional religious conceptions of the afterlife. There is no personal soul that survives bodily death as an individual consciousness. There is no judgment, no reward or punishment, no continuation of personal identity. What remains, if anything, is absorbed back into the infinite substance from which it was never really separate. This is immortality of a sort, but not the immortality that most people desire or that traditional religion promises. Part 12. The Conatus and the Striving for Being. At the foundation of Spinoza's ethics and psychology lies a simple but powerful principle. Everything strives to persevere in its being. This is the Conatus doctrine, from the Latin conari, to strive or endeavour. It is perhaps the most important single concept in Spinoza's practical philosophy, the foundation from which his entire ethical system develops. The conatus is not a force separate from a thing's nature, but identical with it. The actual essence of each thing is its striving to persist in existence and to increase its power of acting. A thing is nothing but this striving. To exist is to strive to continue existing. This applies universally to all things, from the simplest physical bodies to the most complex organisms to conscious human beings. At the physical level, a thing persists through time by resisting forces that would destroy or transform it. A rock maintains its structure against erosion, not through conscious effort, but through the physical forces that hold it together. These forces are the rock's conatus, its striving to persevere in its being. When forces sufficient to overcome this striving act upon the rock is destroyed or transformed into something else. In living things, the conatus becomes more complex and dynamic. An organism must constantly exchange matter and energy with its environment to maintain its organization. It must seek food, avoid dangers, maintain homeostasis. All these activities express the organism's striving to persevere in being and to increase its power. The organism is not a static thing that occasionally acts, but a dynamic process of self-maintenance through active striving. In conscious beings, the conatus appears as desire, as the conscious experience of striving. We feel our desires as motivations to act in particular ways. But these desires are not separate from our essence. They are our essence as consciously experienced. Desire is our very nature as it determines us to act for our preservation and enhancement. This makes desire morally neutral in itself. Desire is not something to be condemned or suppressed, but simply the expression of our nature. What matters ethically is whether particular desires truly serve our conatus, or whether they are based on inadequate ideas and actually diminish our power. The drunkard's desire for alcohol feels like striving for preservation, but actually diminishes their being. The desire is real, but misdirected by inadequate understanding of what truly benefits. The conatus doctrine explains why we value what we value. We do not desire things because we judge them good. We judge them good because we desire them. Goodness is not an objective property that attracts our desire, but a projection of our desiring nature onto objects. We call good what we believe will increase our power, and bad what we believe will diminish it. This appears to make value completely subjective and relative. But Spinoza qualifies this radical conclusion. While different things have different conatus, and thus different goods, beings with similar natures have similar goods. Human beings sharing a common nature share common, genuine interests. What truly benefits one human will typically benefit others because we are all finite modes of the same substance with similar constitutions. The conatus doctrine also explains the origin and power of the emotions. Emotions are not arbitrary feelings, but modifications of the conatus. Joy is the feeling accompanying an increase in our power of acting. Sadness is the feeling accompanying a decrease. Love is joy together with the idea of an external cause. Hate is sadness together with the idea of an external cause. All emotions are expressions of how our power is affected by our interactions with other things. This gives emotions tremendous power over our behavior. They are not separate from our striving, but are that striving as modified by our circumstances. When we feel strong emotion, we are experiencing our essence as enhanced or diminished, our being as expanding or contracting. No wonder emotions overwhelm reason and dominate behavior. They are the very force of our existence asserting itself. The conatus also explains why conflicts arise between individuals. Each thing strives to preserve and enhance itself. When two things' strivings are incompatible, conflict results. If your increase requires my decrease, our conatus brings us into opposition. This is the source of competition, rivalry, and violence in nature and human affairs. But the conatus also explains why cooperation is possible and beneficial. Human beings are social creatures whose power is greatly increased through cooperation. My conatus is better served by alliance with you than by conflict. We can both increase our power more through cooperation than either could alone. This creates the foundation for ethics and politics. The recognition that mutual benefit through cooperation serves individual conatus better than isolated striving. The rational person understands their own conatus and seeks what truly enhances it, rather than what merely seems beneficial to inadequate understanding. This requires knowing one's own nature, understanding what kinds of things genuinely increase human power and what kinds diminish it. It requires distinguishing real goods from apparent goods, actual benefits from temporary pleasures that cause long-term harm. Since understanding itself increases our power more than almost anything else, the rational person seeks knowledge above all. The more adequately we understand ourselves, our circumstances, and our place in nature, the more effectively we can pursue our genuine interests. Ignorance leaves us vulnerable to being affected passively by forces we do not comprehend. Knowledge makes us active agents who can navigate circumstances successfully. The highest expression of conatus is the striving for adequate understanding and the intellectual love of God. When we comprehend how we fit into the necessary order of nature, when we understand ourselves as finite expressions of infinite substance, when we achieve the third kind of knowledge, our power reaches its maximum. We participate in God's infinite intellect. Our understanding is God's self-understanding occurring through the finite mode we constitute. This is the ultimate fulfillment of human conatus. The conatus doctrine is thus simultaneously descriptive and normative. Descriptively, it explains why things act as they do. They are expressing their essential striving to persevere and increase their power. Normatively, it provides guidance about how we should act, by seeking what truly serves our conatus based on adequate understanding rather than inadequate ideas. The ethical life is the life that most fully expresses and enhances human conatus. This is not selfishness in any conventional sense, because genuine self-interest, properly understood, leads to cooperation, knowledge-seeking, and ethical behavior. What diminishes others typically diminishes us, because we depend on social cooperation. What truly benefits us typically benefits others, because we share a common nature. The appearance of conflict between self-interest and ethics arises from inadequate understanding of what truly serves the self. Spinoza's conatus doctrine influenced later thinkers profoundly. Schopenhauer's will to life and Nietzsche's will to power both derive from Spinoza's insight that existence is striving. Evolutionary biology's central concept of reproductive fitness is essentially a biological version of conatus. Psychoanalysis's concept of libido or life drive parallels Spinoza's understanding of desire as essential striving. The conatus remains one of Spinoza's most enduring contributions to understanding human nature and motivation. Part 13. Criticism and Influence. Spinoza's philosophy faced fierce criticism from his contemporaries and has been debated ever since. Understanding the main objections helps clarify what is most radical and controversial in his system, while tracing his influence reveals how deeply his ideas have shaped modern thought despite, or perhaps because of, their scandalous character. The most immediate criticism was that Spinoza's philosophy is atheistic. If God is identical with nature, if God has no will or purposes, if God does not care about human affairs or judge human actions, then what difference remains between this and simple denial of God's existence? Spinoza's God is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the God who hears prayers or performs miracles, not the God who offers salvation or threatens damnation. For most believers, this is atheism, regardless of what terminology is used. Spinoza responded that those who conflate God with nature are not denying God, but understanding God's true nature free from anthropomorphic distortions. God, as infinite substance existing necessarily and containing all reality, is more worthy of intellectual love than any imagined personal deity. But this response satisfied few. The charge of atheism stuck and made Spinoza's work dangerous to read or discuss for generations. A second major criticism concerns determinism and moral responsibility. If all actions are determined by prior causes, if no one could have acted otherwise than they did, how can we hold people responsible for their actions? How can there be genuine morality at all? This objection troubled many who might otherwise have been sympathetic to Spinoza's metaphysics. Spinoza's response, that praise and blame are themselves determined responses that serve social functions without requiring free will, struck many as inadequate. It seems to reduce ethics to mere social engineering, to eliminate genuine right and wrong in favor of useful and harmful, the ethical intuition that people deserve praise or blame for what they freely choose seems deeper than Spinoza's deterministic revision allows. A third criticism targets the mind-body parallelism. If mental and physical events run in perfect parallel without interaction, how do we explain the obvious fact that mental events seem to cause physical ones, and vice versa? I decide to raise my arm and it rises. Pain causes me to cry out. How can these apparent causal connections be merely parallel descriptions of a single event? Critics argue that parallelism denies the obvious to preserve a questionable metaphysical system. Spinoza would respond that the appearance of interaction arises from inadequate understanding. We do not perceive the complete parallel streams of mental and physical causation, but only fragments of each, creating the illusion that events in one stream cause events in the other. But this response seems to make the theory immune to evidence by declaring all apparent counter-evidence illusory. A fourth criticism concerns the identification of virtue with understanding. Spinoza claims that developing adequate ideas and achieving the intellectual love of God constitutes the highest human good. But this seems extraordinarily elitist, making salvation available only to intellectuals capable of abstract metaphysical reasoning. What of the vast majority who lack the capacity or opportunity for such understanding? Are they simply excluded from the highest human fulfillment through no fault of their own? Spinoza acknowledged that few would achieve blessedness, and he showed little concern for making it accessible to everyone. His ethics is frankly aristocratic, designed for the rare individuals capable of rational self-governance rather than for ordinary people. This sits uncomfortably with modern egalitarian values that insist genuine human goods should be accessible to all. A fifth criticism targets the geometric method itself. Spinoza claimed to demonstrate his conclusions with geometric certainty, starting from definitions and axioms and deriving theorems through rigorous proof. But many of his definitions seem question-begging. His axioms are controversial, and his reasoning often makes leaps that are not strictly deductive. The geometric presentation creates an appearance of rigor that the actual arguments do not fully support. Critics argue that Spinoza's confidence in his demonstrations is misplaced, and that the geometric method obscures weaknesses in his reasoning. Despite these criticisms, Spinoza's influence on subsequent philosophy has been enormous. The German idealists, particularly Hegel, drew heavily on Spinoza's monism and his understanding of substance. Hegel saw Spinoza as having grasped the fundamental unity of reality, while failing to understand development and change adequately. Hegel's own system attempted to preserve Spinoza's monism while making it historical and dialectical. Schelling likewise was deeply influenced by Spinoza's identification of God and nature, developing it into a philosophy of nature that saw the physical world as the unconscious mind of God, gradually awakening to self-consciousness. The Romantic movement found in Spinoza a religious naturalism that seemed to preserve spiritual depth while rejecting traditional theology. The 19th century scientific materialists, paradoxically, also drew on Spinoza. His determinism, his rejection of teleology, his naturalistic approach to human psychology all resonated with the scientific worldview. Though Spinoza's metaphysics of substance was too speculative for strict materialists, his method of studying human beings as part of nature influenced the development of scientific psychology and sociology. Nietzsche admired Spinoza as a kindred spirit who had the courage to face reality without illusions. He praised Spinoza's denial of free will, his naturalistic approach to ethics, his recognition that values are projections of human nature rather than objective features of reality. Though Nietzsche's philosophy of will to power differs from Spinoza's determinism in important ways, the family resemblance is clear. In the 20th century, Einstein expressed admiration for Spinoza's God. the impersonal deity identical with the lawful structure of nature. Many scientists found Spinoza's philosophy congenial to a scientific worldview that rejects supernatural intervention while remaining open to wonder at nature's beauty and intelligibility. Spinoza also influenced the development of secular ethics and political theory. His defense of freedom of thought and expression, his advocacy for democracy, his separation of religion and philosophy all contributed to Enlightenment political ideals. His argument that the state exists to enable human flourishing rather than to enforce religious doctrine influenced liberal political theory. Contemporary philosophers continue to engage with Spinoza's ideas. The mind-body problem remains unsolved, and Spinoza's parallelism continues to attract defenders despite its difficulties. Debates about free will and determinism still reference Spinoza's arguments. Environmental ethics finds resources in Spinoza's identification of God and nature for a non-anthropocentric valuation of the natural world. Spinoza's legacy is, thus, deeply paradoxical. He was condemned and marginalized in his own time, his works banned and burned. Yet his ideas proved irrepressible, influencing some of the most important intellectual movements of the modern era. He offered a philosophy that satisfied almost no one completely, but that contained insights too powerful to ignore. He combined radical metaphysical speculation with rigorous systematic thinking, mystical vision with geometric demonstration, religious depth with secular naturalism. This unique combination ensures that Spinoza remains a vital presence in philosophy, perpetually controversial yet perpetually relevant. Part 14. Spinoza's Method and the Geometric Style. One of the most distinctive and initially striking features of Spinoza's ethics is its presentation in geometric form. Like Euclid's Elements, the ethics proceeds through definitions, axioms, propositions, proofs, and corollaries. This form is not merely stylistic decoration, but reflects Spinoza's understanding of philosophy itself and his vision of how truth should be demonstrated and communicated. The geometric method had been used before Spinoza. Descartes appended geometric demonstrations to his meditations to show that his conclusions could be presented in this rigorous form. Various medieval and early modern thinkers had experimented with geometric presentation, but no one before Spinoza had written an entire comprehensive philosophical system in pure geometric form, and few after him would attempt it. The Ethics contains no narrative, no rhetorical flourishes, no appeals to authority or tradition. It presents only definitions, axioms, and demonstrations, proceeding with impersonal logical necessity from foundations to conclusions. Why did Spinoza choose this austere and difficult form? Several reasons can be identified. First, the geometric method embodies Spinoza's conviction that philosophical truth can be demonstrated with certainty equal to mathematical truth. Geometry starts from self-evident definitions and axioms and derives theorems that follow necessarily. Spinoza believed that metaphysics and ethics could be established with the same rigor. The truths of philosophy are necessary truths that follow from the nature of reality, just as geometric theorems follow from the nature of space. Second, the geometric form enforces honesty and clarity. Every assumption must be stated explicitly as an axiom or definition. Every step in an argument must be justified. Nothing can be smuggled in through rhetoric or emotional appeal. The reader can examine the foundations and the reasoning independently, accepting or rejecting them based on rational evaluation, rather than on trust in authority or persuasive presentation. Third, the geometric method reflects the structure of reality itself. God or nature produces everything according to necessity, the way theorems follow from axioms. Understanding reality requires grasping these necessary connections. The geometric form mirrors in language the logical structure of existence, helping readers to see how everything follows necessarily from substance's nature. Fourth, the austere presentation forces readers to think, rather than merely to read passively. The ethics is difficult not because Spinoza deliberately obscured his meaning, but because philosophical truth is difficult. The geometric form does not ease the reader's path, but challenges them to work through the arguments themselves, to struggle with the concepts until understanding emerges. This active engagement is necessary for genuine understanding, as opposed to mere memorization. The method proceeds systematically. Part 1 of the Ethics concerning God establishes the metaphysical foundation, definitions of substance, attribute and mode, axioms about causation and existence, propositions proving that only one substance exists. That substance is God, that God exists necessarily and contains infinite attributes. Each proposition builds on earlier ones, creating a structure where later conclusions depend on earlier foundations. Part 2. On the nature and origin of the mind, derives the nature of mind from the metaphysics of Part 1. The mind is the idea of the body, a mode of the attribute of thought corresponding to the body as a mode of extension. The parallelism of mind and body follows from the nature of substance and attributes. The different kinds of knowledge are defined and their properties demonstrated. Part 3. On the origin and nature of the emotions, treats the passions as natural phenomena, subject to the same necessity as everything else. Definitions of the primitive emotions are given, and from these propositions about complex emotions are derived. The power and bondage of the emotions are explained through geometric demonstration. Part 4 of Human Bondage analyzes why passive emotions dominate most people, and how inadequate ideas lead to self-destructive behavior. The conflict between reason and passion is examined, and the conditions for reason's victory are established. This leads to ethical guidelines that follow from the metaphysics and psychology of earlier parts. Part 5 of The Power of the Intellect explains how understanding can overcome passion and how the mind can achieve freedom and blessedness. The intellectual love of God is demonstrated as the highest good, and the eternity of the mind is proven. The system culminates in a vision of human fulfillment based entirely on the foundations laid in Part 1. This structure is impressively coherent. Unlike philosophical works that present independent essays or discuss topics in no particular order, the Ethics is genuinely systematic. Each part depends on earlier parts. The ethical conclusions of Parts 4 and 5 follow necessarily from the metaphysics of Parts 1 and 2 and the psychology of Part 3. You cannot understand Spinoza's ethics without understanding his metaphysics, because the former is derived from the latter through rigorous demonstration. But the geometric method also has limitations and has attracted criticism. Some argue that it creates a false appearance of rigor. The definitions and axioms that serve as foundations are not self-evident, but controversial. God is a substance consisting of infinite attributes is not obviously true. The way things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other is obviously true. Many of Spinoza's proofs make leaps or rely on unstated assumptions. The geometric form may obscure rather than clarify the actual structure of the arguments. Others argue that the method is poorly suited to philosophy. Geometric demonstration works for mathematics because mathematical objects are completely determined by their definitions. But concepts like God, mind, freedom, and virtue are not fully captured by stipulative definitions. Philosophical understanding requires examining how concepts are used in various contexts, considering objections and alternatives, engaging with the history of thought about these issues. The geometric method's rigid structure prevents this kind of exploratory thinking. Still, others note that the geometric presentation makes Spinoza's work extraordinarily difficult to read. The Ethics is one of the most challenging texts in philosophy, requiring intense concentration and repeated study. Many propositions are opaque on first reading. The logical connections are not always apparent. The reader must constantly refer back to earlier definitions and propositions to follow the argument. This limits the work's accessibility and may have contributed to its initial neglect. Spinoza was aware of these potential objections, but believed the geometric method was worth its costs. Philosophical truth is difficult and should not be made artificially easy. Understanding requires effort, and the geometric form enforces that requirement. The alternative, presenting philosophy through narrative or dialogue, might be more accessible, but would sacrifice rigor and systematicity. In practice, most readers of Spinoza do not work through the geometric proofs step by step, as one might work through Euclid. They read the propositions and scholia, explanatory notes, as philosophical claims and arguments, using the geometric structure as a framework, but not necessarily accepting every deductive step. The Ethics can be read profitably even if one doubts that Spinoza has actually demonstrated his conclusions with geometric certainty. The geometric method remains controversial. Few subsequent philosophers have imitated it, preferring more flexible forms of presentation. But Spinoza's example demonstrates both the possibility and the limitations of treating philosophy as a demonstrative science. Whether or not the Ethics achieves its goal of geometric certainty, it represents one of the most ambitious and impressive attempts to establish philosophical truth through rigorous, systematic reasoning. Part 15. Blessedness and the Intellectual Love of God. Spinoza's philosophy culminates in a vision of human fulfillment that he calls blessedness, or beatitudo. This is not happiness in any ordinary sense, not pleasure or satisfaction of desire, not worldly success or social approval, but something deeper and more enduring, the intellectual love of God and the peace that comes from understanding necessity. Everything in Spinoza's system points toward this culmination. The metaphysics establishes what reality is. The psychology explains how humans function as finite modes. The Ethics guides us toward what serves our genuine flourishing. All of this preparation leads to the final question: what is the highest good for human beings, and how can we achieve it? The highest good is the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis. This consists in understanding how particular things, including ourselves, follow necessarily from God's eternal nature. When we achieve the third kind of knowledge, scientia intuitiva, we see individual occurrences not as contingent facts that might have been otherwise, but as necessary expressions of infinite substance. We comprehend why things must be exactly as they are. This understanding produces a distinctive joy. It is not the passive joy that comes from external circumstances favoring us. It is active joy arising from our own power of understanding. We delight in comprehending reality's structure, in grasping necessity, in perceiving how everything fits together in a rational whole. This joy is necessarily accompanied by the idea of God as its cause. When we understand that particular things follow from God's nature, and when this understanding produces joy, we experience love of God. But this love is very different from conventional religious devotion. We are not loving a personal being who might love us back. We are loving the necessary order of reality itself, delighting in its intelligibility and our participation in understanding it. This love is stable and enduring, because it does not depend on circumstances. The person who loves God because they believe God grants their prayers will cease to love when prayers go unanswered. The person who loves God from fear of punishment loves slavishly and would stop loving if the threat were removed. But the person who loves God intellectually loves necessarily and eternally because their love flows from understanding that cannot be lost except through loss of understanding itself. Moreover, this intellectual love is mutual in a paradoxical sense. Our love of God is part of God's love of himself. When we understand God's nature, God understands himself through us. Our mind, insofar as it achieves adequate understanding, participates in God's infinite intellect. The distinction between our understanding and God's understanding dissolves because there is only one understanding occurring through different modes. This mutual love constitutes the highest possible union between finite mode and infinite substance. We do not become God. That is impossible since we remain finite and God is infinite. But we participate in God's self-knowledge and self-love. The boundary between self and God becomes permeable. We experience ourselves not as separate beings existing independently, but as expressions of infinite substance temporarily taking finite form. This experience transforms our entire relationship to existence. We cease to experience ourselves as isolated selves, buffeted by fortune and struggling against an indifferent universe. We experience ourselves as belonging to reality, as parts of nature, as expressions of the infinite. This belonging produces a deep peace that Spinoza calls blessedness. Blessedness is not the result of external circumstances. The blessed person may suffer misfortune, illness, loss, all the ordinary afflictions of finite existence. But these do not destroy blessedness because it is not based on external conditions, but on internal understanding. The person who comprehends necessity accepts what happens without excessive emotional reaction. They distinguish what is in their power from what is not, working to improve what can be improved, and accepting what cannot be changed. This acceptance is not passive resignation, but active understanding. The blessed person does not give up on life or cease striving. They continue to pursue their conatus, to seek what benefits them, to protect themselves from harm. But they do so from understanding rather than from passion, with realistic assessment rather than false hopes or excessive fears. They are engaged with life, but not enslaved to circumstances. Spinoza describes blessedness in language that sounds almost mystical. The intellectual love of God, which arises from the third kind of knowledge, is eternal. This love is not a temporal feeling that begins and ends, but an eternal reality. When we achieve adequate understanding, we participate in something eternal. Our temporal consciousness touches the timeless. But Spinoza immediately insists that this is not supernatural mysticism, but follows necessarily from his metaphysics. If the mind can conceive things under the aspect of eternity, if adequate ideas are eternal truths, if our understanding participates in God's infinite intellect, then the intellectual love arising from such understanding must be eternal. It exists outside time, even though we experience it temporally. The ethical implications are practical and immediate. We should devote ourselves to achieving adequate understanding and the intellectual love of God. This is not otherworldly escape from life, but the highest form of living. The person who understands is more effective in navigating circumstances, more stable in emotional response, more capable of genuine happiness than the person dominated by inadequate ideas and passive emotions. Spinoza acknowledges that this path is difficult. All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. Few people will achieve blessedness because it requires sustained intellectual effort that most are unwilling or unable to make. The path demands rigorous thinking, honest self-examination, courage to face hard truths, and discipline to live according to understanding, rather than according to passion. But for those who succeed, the reward is immense. The blessed person achieves the only freedom that actually exists: rational self-determination. They overcome bondage to passive emotions and external circumstances. They participate consciously in the necessity that governs all things. They experience the intellectual love of God and the peace that comes from understanding. This is salvation in the only sense that matters. Not escape from the world into some supernatural realm, not personal immortality in heaven, but transformed existence in this world, this life, through understanding and active participation in infinite substance. Spinoza's vision of blessedness offers no consolation for suffering, no promise that everything will work out well, no assurance that the universe cares about human welfare. It is an austere vision that demands much and promises only what is actually achievable: understanding, freedom through accepting necessity, and the joy that comes from participating in God's self-knowledge. For Spinoza, this is enough. This must be enough. This is the highest good available to finite modes of infinite substance, and it is worth the effort required to achieve it. Conclusion: the enduring power of necessity. Baruch Spinoza stands in the history of philosophy as one of its most radical and rigorous thinkers. More than 3 centuries after his death, his ideas remain challenging, controversial, and profoundly relevant. This endurance testifies not to the comfort his philosophy provides, it provides almost none, but to the depth of his insights into the fundamental nature of reality and the human condition. What makes Spinoza eternally relevant is his refusal to compromise truth for consolation. He looked directly at the implications of a deterministic universe governed by impersonal laws and refused to soften them with comforting illusions. There is no personal God who cares about us. There is no free will in any conventional sense. There is no personal immortality. There is no cosmic justice ensuring that virtue is rewarded and vice punished. These are harsh truths that most people cannot accept. Yet Spinoza also shows that accepting these truths need not lead to despair or nihilism. There is meaning and value available to us, but it must be found in reality as it is, not in fantasies about how we wish it were. We can achieve understanding, freedom through comprehending necessity, joy in knowledge itself, and participation in something infinite, even though we are finite. The image of substance remains his most powerful contribution. Everything that exists is a modification of one infinite substance that is simultaneously God and nature. We are not separate from this substance, but expressions of it, temporary finite forms through which the infinite realizes itself. This vision dissolves the boundary between self and world, between human and nature, between secular and sacred. The universe is not dead matter accidentally producing consciousness. The universe is inherently both physical and mental, necessarily producing everything that exists, including our capacity to understand it. This understanding has practical implications for how we live. If we are parts of nature rather than apart from nature, we should seek to understand natural laws and align our lives with them, rather than fighting against necessity. If freedom comes from understanding rather than from metaphysical indeterminacy, we should devote ourselves to developing adequate ideas. If blessedness consists in the intellectual love of God, we should study nature scientifically and philosophically as a form of worship. The ethical life is the life of understanding. Spinoza's political philosophy likewise remains relevant. His defense of intellectual freedom, his advocacy for democracy, his separation of philosophy and religion, his insistence that the state exists to enable human flourishing rather than to enforce orthodoxy. All of these remain vital principles in an age of resurgent authoritarianism and religious fundamentalism. His argument that diversity of opinion strengthens rather than weakens society speaks to contemporary debates about free speech and toleration. His vision of the free state, where rational individuals can flourish, challenges both libertarian atomism and collectivist conformity. The state should provide order without tyranny, security without surveillance, unity without uniformity. This delicate balance is as difficult to achieve now as it was in Spinoza's time, and his insights about how to approach it remain valuable. The problems Spinoza addressed remain our problems. How do we find meaning in a universe that seems indifferent to human values? How do we ground ethics without appeal to supernatural authority? How do we reconcile scientific determinism with moral responsibility and human dignity? How do we live with the knowledge that we will die and that nothing of our individual personality will survive? How do we overcome the bondage of destructive emotions and achieve rational freedom? Spinoza does not provide easy answers to these questions. His philosophy is difficult, demanding, and offers no shortcuts to wisdom or happiness. But it provides resources for addressing these questions honestly without evasion or false comfort. It shows that understanding is possible, that freedom can be achieved through accepting necessity. That meaning can be found in participating consciously in reality's rational structure. We live in an age that Spinoza would recognize. Scientific materialism has undermined traditional religious worldviews for many educated people. Yet, we still struggle to construct satisfying secular alternatives. Technology gives us unprecedented power to transform our circumstances, yet we often use this power destructively because we lack wisdom to guide it. We have access to vast amounts of information, yet we struggle to achieve genuine understanding. Political polarization threatens democracy, while authoritarianism offers false promises of order and meaning. Environmental crisis demonstrates our interdependence with nature and the consequences of treating ourselves as separate from and superior to the natural world. In these circumstances, Spinoza's philosophy offers crucial insights. His identification of God with nature provides a basis for valuing the natural world without appeal to supernatural creation. His understanding of humans as finite modes of infinite substance reminds us that we are not masters of nature, but parts of it, subject to its laws and dependent on its systems. His analysis of the emotions as natural phenomena helps us understand our own irrationality without condemning it as moral failure. We are passionate creatures whose emotions follow from our nature as finite modes constantly affected by external forces. Understanding this does not immediately overcome passion, but it provides the foundation for gradual transformation from bondage to freedom. His vision of ethical life based on adequate understanding, rather than on divine commands or social conventions, offers a model for secular ethics grounded in human nature and genuine flourishing. His political philosophy of democratic governance, intellectual freedom, and religious toleration provides principles for organizing diverse societies without tyranny or chaos. The path forward in the 21st century requires exactly the kind of thinking Spinoza exemplified, accepting change while recognizing patterns, embracing multiplicity while perceiving unity, maintaining critical independence while acknowledging inescapable dependencies, living fully in the present while understanding its connections to past and future. These are not easy tasks, but they are necessary ones for any age characterized by rapid transformation and fundamental uncertainty. Spinoza stands at a unique position in intellectual history. He was condemned as an atheist by religious authorities, yet developed a philosophy saturated with devotion to God. He denied free will, yet showed how freedom could be achieved through understanding necessity. He rejected traditional morality, yet constructed a rigorous ethical system. He was marginalized in his own time, yet profoundly influenced subsequent thought. This apparent paradox reflects the depth and originality of his vision. He saw beyond conventional categories and easy oppositions to a more fundamental understanding of reality. He recognized that the highest truths often seem paradoxical to common sense because common sense is based on inadequate ideas. He had the courage to follow reason wherever it led, regardless of social consequences or traditional authorities. The image of the God-intoxicated man captures something essential about Spinoza. He was intoxicated not with wine but with understanding, drunk on the intellectual love of God, transported by comprehension of necessity. This intoxication was not escape from reality, but the deepest possible engagement with it. It was not mystical obscurantism, but rational clarity achieved through sustained effort. We are like Spinoza, finite modes of infinite substance, striving to persevere in our being, capable through understanding of achieving freedom and blessedness. We exist in a universe that is simultaneously material and mental, determined and free, temporal and eternal. We participate in God's self-understanding when we achieve adequate ideas. Our consciousness is the universe becoming aware of itself. This is not a depressing vision, but a liberating one. It asks us to accept what we are and live accordingly. It frees us from the burden of having to be more than we can be, of having to achieve impossible immortality or cosmic significance. It allows us to appreciate the extraordinary fact that we exist at all, that the universe has produced beings capable of understanding their own temporary existence, that consciousness has emerged from unconscious matter and energy. Spinoza teaches us to live as participants in cosmic necessity, rather than as separate individuals seeking private salvation. We are not outside nature looking in, but inside nature looking around. We are not masters who control reality, but expressions of reality exploring itself. Our questions are the universe asking about itself. Our understanding is the universe understanding itself. Our creativity is the universe creating new forms. This understanding dissolves the boundary between self and world, between human and nature, between subject and object. We are not alien intruders in an indifferent cosmos, but natural products of cosmic evolution. Our consciousness, our rationality, our creativity are not supernatural gifts, but natural capacities that emerge through billions of years of transformation. The logos we seek to understand is not separate from us, but constitutes us. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself. Living according to this understanding requires courage to face hard truths, discipline to maintain focus and effort, wisdom to discern patterns, and humility to accept limitations. It offers no ultimate consolations or final solutions, but it does offer something valuable: the possibility of living with complete honesty and integrity, without illusions or false hopes, in full acceptance of what we are and the circumstances we face. The substance still exists. The modes still modify it. Everything continues to follow necessarily from God's eternal nature. The attributes still express infinite essence in infinite ways. The parallelism of mind and body remains perfect. The conatus still drives all things to persevere in their being. These truths that Spinoza demonstrated in 17th century Amsterdam remain true in our contemporary world. They will remain true for as long as there are conscious beings capable of understanding them.